Not morally cheap, logistically cheap. Armies were made of men who already existed. Weapons were mostly tools they already owned. Campaigns were seasonal, short, and constrained by geography and hunger. Kings didn't need accountants to fight wars. He needed loyalty, horses, and time. Again, one invention changed everything. Gunpowder didn't just make war more destructive. Okay, it made war expensive. And once war became expensive, it stopped being a test of courage and became a test of finance. Welcome to American Life Guide, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. Before gunpowder, power was fragmented. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of lords, vassals, and obligations. Its armies were temporary. Peasants were summoned, fought, and sent home to harvest crops. Knights supplied their own armor. Castles were defensive, not expansive. War had natural limits because it relied on people who still needed to live. No treasury could sustain endless conflict because no treasury had to. If a ruler pushed too far, armies dissolved, food ran out, fractured. The system enforced restraint without needing laws. Then gunpowder arrived in Europe, quietly at first, in the late Middle Ages. At first, it looked unimpressive. Crude cannons were unreliable. Early firearms were slow and inaccurate. Traditional elites dismissed them as noisy curiosities. They were wrong, but not for the reason most people think. Gunpowder didn't matter because it killed knights. It mattered because it killed cheap war. Cannons changed siege warfare overnight. Stone walls that had protected cities for centuries crumbled under sustained bombardment. Fortifications had to be redesigned, thicker, lower, angled. That meant engineers, materials, time, money. Firearms changed armies. Training a knight took a lifetime. Training a musketeer took months, but only if you could afford the weapons. The powder, the supply chain, and the constant resupply. Battles were no longer fought with what soldiers carried on their backs. They were fought with what states could deliver to the front. War stopped being local. It became industrial. Standing armies replaced feudal levies. Soldiers were no longer farmers who fought occasionally. They were professionals who needed year-round pay. Armies no longer disbanded after campaigns. They waited, thrilled, consumed resources, even in peacetime. Victory no longer went to the bravest. It went to whoever could keep paying. This was the moment power began to centralize. Local lords couldn't afford cannons. Small kingdoms couldn't maintain fortresses. Feudal obligations weren't enough to fund continuous war. Only centralized states with predictable revenue could survive in this new reality. Gunpowder didn't just defeat castles, defeated decentralization. And once rulers understood that war now required money, they faced a new problem: where to get it. Temporary taxes weren't enough. Emergency levies couldn't sustain permanent armies. So states did something radical. They normalized taxation. What had once been occasional became constant. What had once been negotiated became assumed. Subjects didn't just owe loyalty anymore. They owed money. But even that wasn't sufficient. Gunpowder wars were vast, prolonged, relentless. The cost of cannons, powder, fortifications, ships, and soldiers exceeded what taxes alone could raise. So, governments turned to borrowing. This is where the financial system truly enters the story. States began issuing debt, not as a last resort, but as a strategy. Bonds funded wars. Credit became a weapon. KCs and financiers replaced nobles as the king's most important allies. A ruler who could borrow could fight longer than a ruler who could earn, even if the latter was more beloved. War stopped being limited by people. It became limited only by credit. And that changed everything. Once wars could be financed, they could be extended beyond public tolerance. Costs could be spread across decades. Losses could be deferred. Inflation could quietly absorb part of the burden. Entire populations could be mobilized financially without ever touching a battlefield. This is the origin of the modern state. Permanent taxation, standing armies, public debt, centralized authority. None of it was invented out of abstract theory. It was invented because gunpowder made war too expensive to fight the old way. The human cost of this shift was enormous. Peasants paid higher taxes. Wages lagged behind prices. Inflation eroded savings. Debts outlived kings and were passed to generations who had never voted for the war or even lived during it. And yet, the system endured because it worked. Gunpowder rewired the cost of war, and by doing so, it rewired the relationship between money and power forever. Once gunpowder turned war into a permanent expense, states faced a problem they had never encountered at this scale. They couldn't pay for it, honestly. Raising taxes high enough to fund standing armies, fortifications, fleets, and continuous supply chains risked revolt. Borrowing large sums risked default, and cutting military spending meant falling behind rivals who were still investing in firepower. So governments did something more subtle. They changed how the cost of war was felt. This is where inflation enters the story, not as a coincidence, and not as a modern invention, but as a structural response to the gunpowder economy. Inflation had existed for centuries. Ancient rulers clipped coins and reduced silver content to survive emergencies, but those episodes were dangerous, short-lived, highly visible. Pushed debasement too far, and trust collapsed immediately. Soldiers refused to pay. Markets seized. Regimes fell. Gunpowder warfare changed that calculus. When war became permanent, states needed a way to spread its cost quietly, gradually, and across people who might never see the battlefield. Inflation did exactly that. Instead of extracting value directly through taxes, governments could extract it indirectly by changing the value of money itself. Instead of demanding more from citizens today, they could demand less from money tomorrow. The burden didn't disappear, it dissolved. This is the key shift. Before gunpowder, inflation solved events. After gunpowder, inflation helped manage systems. Gunpowder wars were not short shocks, they were sustained drains. Cannons didn't just need to be built once, they needed constant replacement. Powder spoiled. Weapons wore out. Fortresses required maintenance, even in peacetime. Armies consumed resources every day they existed. Taxes alone could not keep up. Debt bridged the gap, but debt came with its own problem. Repayment. Inflation quietly solved that too. When prices rise, the real value of debt falls. Governments learned slowly at first, then deliberately, that modest inflation reduced the burden of past wars without forcing explicit defaults. Creditors were repaid in nominal terms, but with diminished purchasing power. The political backlash was muted. The mechanism was invisible to most. War, financed this way, became socially survivable. This is why inflation becomes persistent in gunpowder estates. Not explosive, not hyperinflation that still destroys regimes, but steady erosion, enough to ease pressure, enough to buy time, enough to keep the system functioning. And once this logic exists, it doesn't stay confined to war. Military spending becomes permanent. Debt rolls forward. Inflation becomes tolerated, even expected. Financial systems evolve around managing these pressures rather than eliminating them. Central authorities gain more control, not less, because coordination is required to keep the system stable. This is the true legacy of the gunpowder economy. Not just bigger wars, but financialized war. Violence no longer needed immediate consent. It needed liquidity. Political resistance could be outlasted. Costs could be postponed. Sacrifice could be generalized rather than targeted. In this reshaped society, people who never fought still paid. Savings lost value quietly. Wages lagged prices. Entire generations inherited obligations created by conflicts they never voted for. The link between war and daily life weakened, not because war mattered less, but because its cost was diffused. This is why modern states feel so durable. Today, modern warfare is no longer limited by manpower. It's limited by budgets, aircraft carriers, satellites, cyber systems, logistics networks. These are financial commitments as much as military ones. And just like in the age of gunpowder, the question isn't who fights best, it's who can afford to keep fighting. The uncomfortable truth is that restraint rarely comes from morality alone. It comes from cost. When cost is absorbed, deferred, or disguised through finance, restraint weakens. This doesn't mean war is inevitable. It means war is structural. It lives inside systems designed to make it sustainable. And as long as those systems exist, the relationship between money and violence will remain tight, even when the battlefield feels far away. This is why discussions about debt, inflation, and public finance can never be separated from discussions about power. These aren't abstract economic concepts. They are tools that allow states to project force without immediate collapse. They are the legacy of a world where gunpowder taught rulers a brutal lesson. Whoever controls finance controls endurance. Understanding this doesn't require cynicism. It requires realism. So, when people ask why governments borrow so much, why military budgets feel permanent, why inflation quietly erodes savings, or why wars seem disconnected from daily life, the answer isn't hidden in recent headlines. It's buried centuries deep in the moment when technology made violence too expensive to manage informally. Gunpowder didn't just change war, it's changed what power required to exist. The lesson here isn't that technology is dangerous or that finance is corrupt. It's that systems evolve around the costs they must absorb. When those costs are large enough, they reshape everything upstream, institutions, money, and the lives lived inside them. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme with brutal consistency. When technology raises the price of power, money steps in to bridge the gap. And once that bridge exists, it's rarely dismantled. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. And here at American Life Guide, I'll show you where to look.